Uh, Good evening. Thank you all for coming and for making it out on a rainy Monday. We were hoping for slightly better weather. My name is Eyal Press. I'm a Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation and a contributing writer to The Nation magazine and the moderator for tonight's discussion. The event tonight is taking place thanks to the New America Foundation, and in particular thanks to Michael Lind and Sheryl Schweninger. Michael is the director of the New America's Economic Growth Program, and it's also taking place thanks to Katrina vanden Heuvel, who is the editor of The Nation, and The Nation will be publishing a feature story based on the presentations of the panelists and the conversation that happens tonight. I want to thank them all for entrusting me to moderate what I know will be a lively, stimulating, and very timely discussion on an extremely important subject. Almost exactly 1 year ago, the New York Times Magazine published a lengthy interview with Barack Obama, in which he stated, in reference to the philosophy of his economic advisors, I quote, "One of the things that we all agree to is that the touchstone for economic policy is, does it allow the average American to find good employment and see their incomes rise? We want to make sure that prosperity is spread across the spectrum of regions, occupations, genders, and races." Well, since President Obama spoke those words, prosperity has returned, to some extent, for owners of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. It has not returned for the roughly 1 in 6 Americans who are unemployed or underemployed. It has not returned for the 5.7 million Americans who turn to a food pantry or a soup kitchen every week, a figure that has risen 27% in the last 4 years. Inequality in America fuels a great deal of anger. We hear it all the time on the television, airwaves, etc., sometimes in everyday conversation. It's very popular right now and very easy to rail at bankers, at Goldman Sachs, at elites of all stripes. Unfortunately, the anger doesn't always translate into clear thinking and smart policies. This panel discussion is meant to fill that gap. The panelists will assess the contours of inequality in America today and examine what can be done about it in light of structural realities, political constraints, and global trends. Each of the panelists will speak for about 6 to 8 minutes, and after they speak, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of them based on the presentations, and then we're going to turn to all of you, and I hope you participate and ask questions. So let me introduce each of the panelists, and they will come up after I describe them in the order I've described. Jeff Madrick is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and a fellow also at the New School. He is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, the longtime editor of the magazine Challenge, and he has written for just about every publication out there, from the Washington Post to the New York Times Magazine to the Huffington Post to The Nation. He's the author of numerous books, including, most recently, the provocatively titled The Case for Big Government, which was one of 2 2009 Penn Galbraith Nonfiction Award finalists. Orlando Patterson is a sociologist at Harvard whose interests range from ethno-racial relations in the United States to the culture and practice of freedom to issues like poverty. He served for 8 years as a special advisor for social policy to Prime Minister Michael Manley of Jamaica. He's the author of numerous books, including Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, which won the National Book Award, and his work has also appeared in dozens of publications, from the New Republic to the Washington Post to the New York Times. Catherine Newman is a sociologist at Princeton and the author of numerous books about class, social mobility, and the struggles of working poor Americans to make it into the middle class. These books include Chutes and Ladders, No Shame in My Game, and most recently, The Missing Class, which is about the 57 million Americans who are neither officially poor nor comfortably middle class. She directs Princeton's Institute for International and Regional Studies and has written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and numerous other publications. And Jacob Hacker is a political scientist at Yale, a resident fellow at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and a former fellow who still carries an affiliation with the New America Foundation. He is the author of numerous books, including The Great Risk Shift, which is a terrific study of rising insecurity among middle-class families, and the forthcoming, also provocatively titled, Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and... I'm sorry, I've lost the end of it. How Washington Made the Rich Richer is quite enough. We all know it has. In any event, apologies to Jacob, but his columns and articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, the American Prospect, and the Nation. So with no further ado, I will cede the podium to Jeff Madrick, and as I said, we will welcome your questions afterwards.
Well, thank you, Ale. I like that introduction. I think you should come with me to all events. Thank you, New America Foundation. Thank you, the Nation. Thanks, folks, for showing up. Appreciate seeing you here. Perhaps I shouldn't be the first to speak because I have something I've been saying for a long time. America does not have an inequality problem. It has a stagnation of income problem. It has a runaway of incomes at the very top. And when we define it as inequality, and I don't mean to say this categorically, but when we define it as inequality, we get a little bit off message. What I mean by stagnation of incomes, as you know, is the failure for median incomes to rise in America, or they rose very slowly. For male workers, they simply failed to rise for 40 years at the median, discounted for inflation. That doesn't mean the 25-year-old is making less now that he's 65. It means the 25 or 35-year-old today is making less than the 25 or 35-year-old 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, that is a big shift as far as we can tell in history in America. What is the American dream? Is it getting to the top of the pyramid? Couldn't be. By definition, not everyone can get to the top of the pyramid. What it really has been is a general rise in the absolute standard of living, the real wage for most American workers. You may think you have a better job than your dad because you wear a white collar and your dad or mom wore a blue collar. In fact, in the pyramid, it may be, relatively speaking, in the same place, but you make more money, discounted for inflation. That was the American dream, and it by and large stopped somewhere in the late 60s and early 70s. And I know all the arguments about about new products and so forth. We always had new products in America. They were always, not always, but at least since the second half of the 1800s, and in fact, to some degree in the first half of the 1800s, they were always astonishing compared to what happened before. But always, even cyclically, real wages rose at the median. Real wages rose for women moderately, not particularly robustly, and still by most measures, they remain below the level men make for equivalent educations, equivalent age, and even for equivalent jobs. What did we learn in this last recession? Well, for me, this merely corroborated the runaway at the top thesis, that America's problem is stagnation, not inequality. What we learned from this crisis, and many of us suspected it or knew it before, but it made it stark, is that the people making all that money at the top were somehow not really associated with the real economy. The idea of inequality at the top is that somehow Andrew Carnegie created 1 million jobs, perhaps, in the steel factories, a great industrial revolution, and took a heck of a lot of profit for himself in the process. It is by no means clear, as you well know now, that the financial people who are making all this money and distorted the curve way up here were contributing to the economy in the same way. It was, again, I'd love to talk about this a little bit, and collateralized debt obligations, but it was games people played with each other. And in fact, not only did it likely not contribute to the economy, I don't think that's me, it probably, it may have hurt the real economy by misallocating capital along the way. Now, with one other shocking thing, at least surprising to me, occurred in 2008. When you look at household income, it turns out that the bottom 90% lost more than the top 90% in the recession of 2008. That's pretty much counter-historical. And to me, maybe the most frightening bit of news, because it suggests something deeply structural is going on in America in terms of lost jobs and floundering wages. That worries me a lot. That, for me, is a new bit of data that I think we should be thinking about. Maybe we can discuss it a little more here. Maybe people have looked into it a little more closely than I. You know the numbers about the runaway at the top. Basically, let me talk about two ways of measuring it. One is the Piketty-Sayez method, which estimated incomes in the very top 1%, because most of the government measures did not estimate those top 1% incomes. And just quickly, in 1977, 10% of Americans under this method, 10% of Americans made 33 to 34% of income, including or excluding capital gains. In 2002, that rose, 2002, that rose to 42 to 44% of income. Between 2002 and 2007, in only 5 years, at the top end, it rose from 44% to 50%. Runaway at the top. Household income, measured by the Census Bureau, which doesn't include something called top code. It doesn't include that very top. The 95 to 50 measure of income, the 95th percentile versus the 50th percentile, the typical worker, the median, rose from 2.26, a ratio of 2.6 income in the 95th to the 50th, to 3.6 in 2005. Top half inequality expanded rapidly. Top half 50% and above. What happened below the top half, the bottom half? Depending on the measure you use, it either stayed stable since the late 60s or early 70s, or stabilized in the early 1990s. There is no serious change in bottom half inequality. The inequality all occurred at the top. So what happens when you talk about inequality in general? You get all these highfalutin generalized theories from economists who obviously make their living generalizing, and I would often argue overgeneralizing from data. And what do they say? Well, there was an educational bias. Work became more sophisticated. Those with better educations got better jobs. I think there's some truth to that, but I think it was highly exaggerated. It's very hard to explain the change from 92 to 2008, 2007 that is, but if you run the statistical analyses, you can see some effect for education. And then we confront the financial crisis. And then we say, did all those MBAs make all that money because they were well educated? Did anybody ever truly believe that except a couple of writers in the Financial Times? Kept talking about the super talented? Or were we talking about the super ambitious? And I don't want to get too aggressive. I guess at the moment I'm a little angry because finally the market rigging is coming out. But the super ambitious, the super The semi-unscrupulous, let me not get too aggressive. Is that who made the money? Well, a couple of mainstream economists, and I emphasize the word mainstream, did some work on this, and I think many of you are familiar with it. A guy named Tom Philippon at NYU did some work on this, and Larry Katz and Claudia Golden at Harvard. And they tried to get a benchmark to see, did these people really deserve that based on any characteristic, really deserve that money? And I'll oversimplify here. Did they deserve to make that much money given their native talents and how hard they worked, the riskiness of the jobs they took based on the volatility of their incomes in the Philippon study? Larry Katz did a study of Harvard classes 10 years apart, which was very useful because you could get an awful lot of data about graduating students and measure it. Both studies from mainstream economists raised serious questions about the justification of those high levels of income by an enormous magnitude. And what did they suggest? They suggested something odd is going on in the world of finance. Economists call it rents. Some of us now, I think, feel more free to call it market rigging and manipulation. Something was going on, and it contributed enormously to the inequality data. Now, even if you take the direct finance people out of the inequality data, you'll still get pretty high inequality at the top. But did the finance slip over into demand for corporate lawyers and other professionals and marketing professionals and accounting professionals and boost salaries there? And did finance slip over into the executive boardroom? Well, we know it did. CEO incomes based on stock price, rises in stock prices and enormous options, which did not have to be shown on the income statements until the early 2000s. And lots of executives beneath the CEO level. My argument then is we probably have a bigger problem than just inequality. We have to deal with this issue of stagnation of income for most Americans. And I think talking about inequality per se and talking about inequality affects society leaves open both conservative arguments that to me make no sense. For example, rapid growth is always accompanied by inequality, therefore don't worry about it. And other mainstream arguments like skill bias, technological change. The fact is a lot of factors are affecting the plight of workers in America. We have more, I think, and do I say it too strongly to call it a catastrophe? We have a potential catastrophe building here, especially when you look at the 2008 data. And then on top of that, how did we deal with it in the 2000s? We borrowed. And doesn't it bug you? Because it bugs me a lot whenever I see anybody in the press or on TV said, we got to live within our means. That's what's wrong with America. As if everybody was on a great spending spree, a luxury spending spree. Well, it turns out that the middle 60% borrowed increased borrowing between 2000 and 2007 from 100% of income to something like 155 or 160% of income. Most of it was mortgage borrowing. So what did they do with that money? Did they go on a spending spree? It's impossible to document that spending by that middle 60% rose faster in the 2000s when people were borrowing all that money than between 1989 and 2001 and 2002. It was basically the same. In fact, if you look at the NEPA numbers, which is not just the 60%, but the 100% of consumption, consumption actually rose more slowly in the 2000s when all that borrowing was going on, then the personal household borrowing was going on, than in the 1990s. People borrowed to make up for that stagnation problem. Now they're not going to be able to borrow. So what the heck are they going to do if they don't get jobs? What the heck are they going to do if the jobs they do have don't pay them better wages in light of how poorly wages have been doing? I won't get into the family income, decreases in family income, wages, and so forth. Probably The rest of the group will talk a little bit about that. I look forward to talking about policy solutions later in the panel. I probably have used my, are you the timekeeper? Do I have another 7 or 8 minutes? No. I'll wrap up right now. I'm sure I went over. Thank you again. Very nice to be here.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'm always delighted to come to Washington. It seems like such a big city compared with my own Cambridge. And so I was especially pleased to see what looks like a civic event. We don't have much of this in Cambridge. Professors like to talk to themselves and each other. Okay. I'd like to address the issue of, let me see, race and inequality. And if we can get this going. Okay. All right. Okay. I want to start with what I've been calling the American paradox. And that is with respect to race, and I'll focus on Black Americans, though this to some extent applies to Hispanic, but I'll be focusing on African Americans. It's the paradox here is the near complete acceptance of African American in the public sphere, combined, on the other hand, with persisting social separation and extreme inequality. In many ways, our president embodies this in very complex ways. The civil rights movement, what did it achieve? This public inclusion. Blacks are now a defining element in American body politic and public culture. We all know the rise of the black middle class via improved education, public policies such as affirmative action, entitlement programs, anti-discrimination laws and policies. The integration in the military, which should not be, cannot be emphasized enough. The major role of blacks in popular culture, all aspects of popular culture, both so-called mass culture and elite culture. Jazz is the musical voice of America. The role of public figures such as Oprah Winfrey, who, when she threatened to do away with her book club, sent the entire publishing industry in mourning. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, plus her influence on Middle Americans. And of course, black political participation and leadership, the culmination of which is, of course, the election of a black president. This is, by any definition, a revolution in the public acceptance of a group that was once completely, almost completely excluded. In fact, a group who defined what belonging meant as whiteness, in the sense that being America was to be white, and being white is in many ways defined as not being black. So this was a revolution, and America has every reason to be proud of this when compared with other majority white societies. There's just no comparison. It's been a tremendous achievement, and yet, incredibly, there is the problem of what was not achieved. It did not close the income or wealth gap. It did not change the condition of the black poor. In fact, the black poor are, in relative terms, as poor as, or even poorer than they were in relative terms, and also taking account of in constant dollars may even be worse off. It did not change the unemployment gap, which now is the gap between white and black unemployment is the worst in 13 years, and getting worse by the day, in the sense that the blacks have been more adversely affected than any other group. There was an initial closing of the gap educationally, which we all lauded, and it was very encouraging, but that stopped, and that's in reverse now. There is also the stunning recent, relatively recent finding of downward mobility from the black middle class. That is, the gains are not being held, but are being lost. The Pew Foundation report a couple years ago, which has been followed up by several studies, indicate high levels of downward mobility from the black middle class. More than a half of middle class kids earn less than their parents, and of the group who are downwardly mobile, a half go to the bottom. Then, of course, there's the catastrophic increase in incarceration. The data on this you must all be aware of. More black men are in prison than white men, even though blacks are 13% of the population. And as my colleague Bruce Weston has pointed out, this has immediate effects on inequality. It partly contributes to black inequality. And there's residential segregation, which in many respects has either remained the same or in some respects has worsened. School segregation now, from recent work, is worse now than it was in 1970. How can one reconcile these two trends? Public inclusion to the degree that a majority of white society elects a black president. Persisting complete exclusion. Blacks have very few friends among whites, live in residences that are completely different. And this is true not just of the inner cities, it's true as several sociologists, Douglas Massey, more recently Mary Patula has noted, it's true of the middle classes. How is this possible? How does America reconcile these two? And it's very much related to inequality, which is at the center of this problem. Now, I'm not going to, these things take too much time. I mean, I have some figures here showing that if you look at the quintile household income, there's very little, even the top quintile is only 68% of the white group. The problem of wealth, in fact, is, as you can see, white wealth is over 10 times that of blacks and getting worse. And the poverty has just gotten significantly worse in recent years. Over the Bush years, in fact, after significant gains during the Clinton years, it's gotten much worse. With respect to joblessness, the fact that the black rate is so substantially higher and the gap is getting much greater. And what's more, that racial difference in joblessness persists at every educational level. The inequality in incarceration, well, this is such a tragic story. It pains me to go into it. But the figures speak for themselves. And as I said, Bruce Weston has done a great job showing how this, in fact, contributes substantially to inequality. Now, what I want to, so I've raced through that. I mean, I really would like to share with you some ideas about what essentially, how do we explain this inequality? How do we explain this paradox? I want to make two sets of distinctions between external and internal factors and between proximate and underlying causes. First, the external, internal division. There are a set of factors favored by liberals, all my friends, and it's Harvard and maybe here, who knows, which emphasizes the externalities, discrimination, historically Jim Crow, racism, segregation, but as several studies have shown, it still persists, although it's declined substantially. It's still there in housing, in employment, and so on. There's institutional factors, the bad schools which are now very much in the news, and other factors. There are locational factors, that blacks are living in areas which are suffering the most in the sort of Rust Belt, in parts of the Deep South, Mississippi, and so on, the Delta. And of course, policy factors, which historically, as you know, the sort of redlining, the building of the suburbs, sort of deliberately excluded blacks, and so on. Monetary policy that emphasizes inflation control rather than employment. And sentencing laws, which in good part, though not entirely, the drug laws, which account for a substantial part of the gross inequalities in incarceration between whites and blacks. The internal factors, which tend more to be emphasized by conservative and which we must address, because it's usually the case that people who emphasize one set of factors tend to simply neglect the other, or frown very much on the other, or yell at people who emphasize the other, as I have found to my cost. But look, the familial factors are important. The fragility of the black family, the fact that the lone female-headed household, it directly contributes to the high poverty rate and inequality of blacks. The identity issues, again, this is very controversial. I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion. But identity refers to certain kind of preferences, certain kinds of styles of behavior, and so on, which works in some respects, certainly politically, but may not work in other respects. What I call alternate cultural styles and patterns, for want of a better term, instead of terms such as oppositional culture and so on. I can explain more of what that means, but there is an alternate cultural, which I'm right now with a group of scholars very much involved in studying. Dropping out, a horrendous dropout rate. For a long time, this was hidden by a sleight of hand used by the educational authorities, in which dropout rates were assessed, measured just in terms of proportion of seniors who graduate, which gave a very rosy picture of what the situation, hid the real truth, which is to use the measure which you should use, which is what percentage of freshmen graduate 4 years later. And that is almost as catastrophic, really, as the incarceration rate, because it turns out that it's in the region of about 45% of black kids are not graduating. And in certain areas, in certain cities, metropolitan areas, it rises to well over half. The gang life and so on. It's very interesting. You easily see the difference here. For example, I read a blog by George Posner and Gary Becker, for example. And it's interesting that Becker had a blog recently on inequality, and what he emphasizes is what I'm calling the internal cultures. That is, the family, the fragile families, the cultural issues dropping out. They are important. I'm not saying they're not. But we need a somewhat more nuanced approach, which is what I would like to leave with you, at least open up for discussion. I want us to take account of both. The externalities, historical and structural ones, slavery, Jim Crow, northern racism and segregation, some of which still persist, but which sort of set the pattern and set in chain a set of factors which lead to where we are now, the approximate set of causes, which are the fragile families, gender and marital relations, dropping out and so on, and the externalities, the discrimination which persists, and segregation in sports schools and so on. I have these two set of arrows because I think the two reinforce each other, and that is why one cannot make neat distinctions between the two. And good analysis has got to look at the way in which one influences the other. Let me just give you one simple example. The people who emphasize the externalities, like my dear friend and colleague William Julius Wilson, points out the role of joblessness in accounting for low marital rates and with it sort of family fragility. Men who are unemployed feel shame and present problems with the family. Now, that may be true, but the reverse is also true. As the economist George Akerlof has argued, people who marry tend to have low unemployment rates. If you're married and if you're committed to a family and you've got children to look after, you become employed and you stay employed. You'll take jobs which you may not really want, but there is, so it works both ways. The same goes for incarceration. So my colleague Bruce Weston has emphasized the way in which incarceration powerfully influences the community into which those who are released re-enter, and the unemployment problems again. Once you have a record, it's hard to get jobs, so recidivism rate goes high. And that also makes them very unmarriageable. So women don't have men to marry. As Kathy Eden has pointed out, there's just not much good prospects. And so there's a clear case of an externality having dismal consequences socially. But then if one may ask, why is the incarceration rate so high? Why is the drug taking so high? And it's not just drugs which account for it. I mean, the people are incarcerated because they commit a very high proportion of crime. That goes back to familial life, okay? If you're brought up as a kid by a single mother who has to work 2 jobs and just doesn't have the time, even though she may have all the love in the world, I mean, you're going to end up seeking the support and discipline of the gangs, and who become your parents. And study after study indicate that that's one of the roles of the gangs. They provide the kind of paternal, familial support that is just not in the family. So you both reinforce each other. Well, with this kind of more nuanced, complex view, which embraces what is often associated with more conservative and more liberal positions, the question then is, what kind of policy options do we have, and how do we go about this? And just very quickly go through this. There are 2 sets of distinctions, sort of the universal as opposed to the targeted approaches, and external or internal. That is, are we going to emphasize policies which do not emphasize blacks as such, but which applies to the entire category, which is much broader than just a race group? Or do we target blacks, which has been the policy option for a very long time, which is preferred by blacks? External or internal? Are we going to, whether we use targeted or universal, focus on the externalities or the internal cultural issues? Now, one can use a universalist for external problems. This is a classic liberal approach, if you like. And this approach Obama clearly prefers, based on what I've read in his 2 autobiographies. Education, training, health care, which he's come through with that, and monetary policy, tax credit, minimum wage, poverty floor, rigorous anti-discriminatory policies, and I have a big question, affirmative action. As you know, Louis, the last time the Supreme Court sort of had a statement on this, Sandra Day O'Connor gave it 15 years life. Now that's about 10 years ago. Obama's been quite quiet on this, and it's not clear whether, in fact, we're not sort of the full coming to an end on that. But we can also use targeted approaches for internal cultural issues. Culture is not a fixed entity; it can change, and there we again external policies that might influence attitudes and behavior. The Bush administration, give them their due. It didn't work, but they did put some money where their mouth is in emphasizing the family as important. They did throw a lot of money. Many people think it was wasted, but the point is they did throw a lot of money on sort of, if you like, targeting familial change. We know how. Thank you. And finally, early education, prison reform, school curriculum change, and family support are all kind of external policies which can sort of influence internal cultural approaches. Right now I'm with a graduate student studying one interesting effort done by those groups which try to rehabilitate, to change attitudes in order to improve the employment prospects of low-income kids. And finally, of course, there's the internally oriented approach. Here, in fact, in a nutshell, only black Americans can change this. We're talking about the kind of gender problems among blacks and the kind of moral issues which the church will have to become very much involved with in community reform. So that's, in a nutshell, is the more complex, nuanced approach that I think policymakers will and should adopt. Instead of this either sort of emphasizing the liberal externalities or the conservative emphasizing, the moral sort of internal issues. We have to really be honest, recognize that both sets of cause apply, and policies will have to address both. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I took my assignment pretty strictly and seriously to do 6 to 8 minutes on who's really taking the brunt in this recession. And to some extent, this thing's beeping at me, what the long-term effects might be, or what we might expect in terms of long-term effects, especially on young people. So I'm going to try and introduce here some numbers on who's losing more heavily than others in terms of race, education, and then focus on age or generation. And I want to direct our attention to the possibilities of persistent scarring effects of a deep recession of the kind that we are mired in. I don't know if you can see. Can we dim these front lights a little bit so people can see this a bit more? No? I guess not.
Oh, we can see.
Can you see?
Yeah.
All right. So racial disparities in the unemployment rate have persisted over the last 4 decades or so. But as this slide shows, well, actually you can't see it very well. There are some gray bars there that mark recessions over the last 30, 40 years or so. In times of recession, we tend to see exacerbation in racial differences in unemployment. And that is a problem that we face right now, as Orlando alluded to, where we've got white unemployment rates of about 7.9% and black unemployment rates of about 13.3%. This is certainly the case in the current economic climate, so this brings us right up to more or less now, or a couple of months ago. The unemployment rate for African Americans is almost twice that of whites. This is partly because the occupational concentration of workers by race and ethnicity differs so much. Workers of color, especially blacks and Latinos, tend to concentrate in the occupational categories like construction, maintenance, transportation, and so on, that have very high levels of unemployment and thus much higher levels of insecurity. So part of what we're looking at is the patterning of race and ethnicity against occupation and the occupations that have been particularly hard hit by unemployment. The unemployment rate is not evenly distributed across levels of education, of course, and Jeff cast some doubt on the role of education in explaining inequality, and I completely agree that the runaway at the top has nothing to do with education. But in the middle, there's still a significant impact, I think, of education here. Workers with less than a high school diploma are bearing the brunt of unemployment right now, and we can see steadily increasing fortunes as educational attainment rises. So workers with a bachelor's degree or higher have an unemployment rate of only 5%. But if we look at workers who are below less than a high school diploma, it's up at 15.6%, and that is not a non-finding. That actually really does matter. But to go to one of the points Orlando raised, there's persistent racial inequality even if you are able to find work and obtain higher levels of education. So what this slide shows us is that even when you hold educational attainment constant, workers of color have lower average earnings than white workers even at the same education level. So white workers with a bachelor's degree earn on average $13,000 to $15,000 more than black and Latino workers respectively. So there are problems with racial inequality even when we're talking about people who have done the right thing, as Orlando would say, and pursued higher education. So these questions about race are ones which we've touched upon, or Orlando touched upon them, and they're very important. But one dimension that we tend not to look at as carefully is age. And this one actually worries me more than any. Young workers are incredibly hard hit in times of economic recession. And the potential for long-term scarring to occur, by which I mean acquiring an irregular or somewhat suspect biography in the labor market, which becomes very hard to explain even when things get better, even when the economy recovers. Workers who enter a labor market like this one can expect to see their wages suffer for at least 10 years, and sometimes in some studies, for example, studies of the cohorts that entered the labor market during the Great Depression, for the rest of their lives. So when you enter a labor market like this one and you're unable to find work, at the ages at 16 to 24, you're looking at potential persistent effects, and it's very, very high right now for young workers. And it's not just, I mean, teenagers are especially hard hit, and they have been increasingly so. So we can see that 16 to 19-year-old workers, up to 49% unemployment, almost 50% unemployed among black teenagers. So race, of course, enters into this. It's not the same across racial groups within the youth cohort, but in general, the youth cohort is looking pretty sick. And that's very worrisome, because when things get better, they don't necessarily reap the benefits. And the same thing is true for young adult workers, so 20 to 24. Since January of 2008, the unemployment gap between young adult white workers and young adult black workers has been increasing dramatically, but all the way around, the 20 to 24 age group is looking pretty bad. And it's been getting worse to some degree over time. So if we look at the recession, this recession, that's the dark black line, 2007, this is the month since the start of the recession, and you can see how unemployment has just been growing and growing and growing for this cohort over the past 4 recessions. I want to dwell a little bit on what we know about the scarring effect of labor market entry in a recession. So there are 3 points to carry away from here. First, even if you're at the high end of the education spectrum, graduating from college in a recession is associated with an initial loss of earnings of about 9%. That effect goes down if the economy recovers in about 5 years, and 10 years later tends to disappear for college-educated workers. But if we look at graduates with the lowest predicted earnings, they have much more persistent earnings losses, and that has real consequences for inequality. So a typical recession in which unemployment rates rise by about 5% or so implies this initial loss of earnings of about 9%. But the persistent effects from changes in labor market conditions are much larger for individuals who are in the process of searching for work, that is, people who are at the beginning of their careers, than for people who are already working. For those who enter a labor market in this condition and stumble into it and continue to stumble, they don't recover their footing. They are stumbling all the way along for the rest of their lives. And in the Great Depression, the studies we have, like Glenn Elder's, that followed the cohorts that entered the labor market at that point, they not only never recovered in earnings, they didn't marry at the same rates, they didn't have the same occupational trajectories, they were less healthy, they died younger. The effects of a Great Depression are profound throughout the life cycle. So this is something really to worry about with respect to young people who are entering a labor market like this, because their fortunes in life may not change that dramatically even when we recover. Well, I've been dwelling particularly on unemployment, but in the last 2 minutes or so of my assigned time, I want to turn to an issue that we don't often cover as much, and that is underemployment. Labor underutilization, which includes underemployment, is an important problem in this recession. And what this slide shows us is that when we include workers who are employed part-time for economic reasons, meaning involuntarily part-time, and discouraged workers, workers who have just given up the hunt because they're not finding anything out there, we have a much larger proportion of the American labor force that is affected than just those who are unemployed, much larger. So if we add those who are unemployed part-time for economic reasons to all these other categories, we're up to way higher, nearly 17%. Now, Andrew Sum and his colleagues have looked at the dimensions of underemployment and have given us some interesting findings here. I want to credit them for this, about the demographics of those who are underemployed. And what they find is that the hours underemployment, meaning those who are employed part-time for involuntarily, is heavily concentrated among households with incomes in the lowest 2 deciles. So underemployment is not uniformly distributed, it's impacting especially those at the bottom. But if we were to include people who are underemployed in terms of their skills, that is, people who are working in jobs for which they are technically overqualified, we would see more workers in the middle and the top of the income distribution impacted by underemployment. And this strikes me as an important political issue because it helps to tie together those who are more advantaged but still suffering relative to what they expected in the labor market. If we look at total labor underutilization, which includes the unemployed and discouraged workers, we see again that it's concentrated among households at the very bottom of the income distribution. Let me conclude my 6 minutes, because I really was trying to hold to that timing there. That conservatives often argue that the problem is productivity. This is sort of the usual fallback position. But when we look at what has happened to productivity in the United States, we see steadily rising productivity. This is not the reason why the American workforce is suffering the way it is. American workers have been becoming increasingly productive since 1990, while their average earnings have remained relatively flat. And that is part of the inequality story, because those who are reaping the benefits of that productivity, as Jeff pointed out, are way up at the top of the income distribution. And those who are running just to stay put are all the rest of us. So I hope those numbers help put a little bit of empirics behind some of the more, the broader generalizations that we've been talking about this afternoon. I think it's really very worrisome, especially those scarring effects, because the economy may well recover, but a deep recession of this kind can leave its tracks in the lives, especially of young people, who may never see that kind of recovery, or it may take them a decade to get there. Thanks.
Okay, well, I guess I turn out to be the pinch hitter at the end of this section of our remarks, and I'm going to try to keep to my 6 minutes as well. What? Cleanup hitter. Thank you. Cleanup hitter. Okay, and I'm not a baseball fan. I like cycling. I can't. So I'm in the broom wagon, as we say in cycling, the last person in the race. Okay, so. I was actually running behind here because I have a long-standing relationship with New America Foundation, and actually the last time I was at New America Foundation, their offices were up in DuPont Circle, which is where I was just a few minutes before our panel started, and I was worried that I was worried that I would be late. For my portion of the remarks, I didn't realize that I would be the cleanup hitter, and therefore I shouldn't have worried. I'm also pleased that I can say my title much more quickly now. So it's, just so you know, it's the winner-take-all politics, how Washington made the rich richer and turned its back on the middle class. But you know, the shorter, pithy titles are usually better, so maybe I should just take that as an editorial comment. I feel like I'm going to have to start with a cliche, but after viewing the Goldman emails, I feel like we're all living in a cliche. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And Jeff already showed us how both sides of that familiar phrase, familiar two sentences are playing out right now. But I'll just throw in a couple stats that are eye-opening or eye-popping. The top 38 firms on Wall Street paid collectively $140 billion in 2009, which I guess was a little bit of a down year compared with 2007, when Lloyd Blankfein was doing the Lord's work and earning $68 million doing it. It was, of course, not as impressive a year when you look at some of the bonuses, but that's only because, as the New York Times put it, the Wall Street was facing a, quote, dilemma of riches, how to wrap its eye-popping checks in a mantle of moderation. Now, needless to say, that was not exactly the dilemma that was faced by most Americans in 2009. And yet, I think it's very important for us to remember that this is a very long-term story. And the best numbers on this, Jeff started to talk about the Census Bureau and the Piketty and Saez numbers. The best numbers on this are the Congressional Budget Office numbers that bring together the income tax statistics and the Census Bureau statistics and actually throw everything in: taxes, private benefits, government benefits, even in-kind benefits like health insurance. And here's what they show. Between 1979 and 2006, which are the years for which we have this data, the top 1% took 36% of all the growth in household incomes over that period. If you look at 2001 to 2006, it was more than half, 53% of all gains. And that's including everything. That's that includes health insurance. That includes the earned income tax credit. It includes the tax code, which we might think had gotten more progressive over this period. In fact, if you look at the very top, it certainly didn't. And if you look at the very, very top, we only have that for 1979 to 2005, the top 0.1%, okay, 1 in 1,000 households took 20% of all income gains over that entire period. And that compares to 13.5% for the entire bottom 60%. So this is a long-term story. 1979 to 2006, as Jeff said, it's a story about runaway gains at the top and slow to no growth in the middle and the bottom. So why? I mean, that's the obvious question. How can this be? And I think there's a lot to be said in the 2 minutes I have remaining. So I'll just say, I'll just first of all plug my book, which has already been plugged, and say that you'll have to wait until the book to get the full story. I was actually working on the way down, and the guy sitting across from me was giving me very suspicious looks, and I noticed that what he had in front of him was not the page proofs for a book, but actually a compensation report for Bank of America. And I really was kind of concerned that when I went to the bathroom, I actually closed it up just so he wouldn't read it. I thought maybe I'd actually be the victim of some kind of reverse populist rage. So the book makes 4 arguments, and I'll summarize them here. The first is that the winner-take-all economy is really the rise of this winner-take-all economy is really the defining economic transformation of our times. And it's more than just the relative gains. It's really about the declining economic security and also declining long-term upward mobility that we've seen for everyone outside of the narrow winner's circle. So this has been, as we put it in the book, this has not been a victimless crime. And you can get a sense of just how concentrated and sustained these gains are and how little trickle down seems to have occurred, that when you look at the CBO numbers and compare the average growth in household income over this period with the growth at different points in the income ladder, you have to get all the way up to the top 10% before you see households experiencing income growth in excess of the average for this period. So only the top 10% over this period experience growth in excess of average household income growth. So the second argument is that this transformation in our economy is deeply rooted in what government has done and, more important in some ways, what it's not done. And I think we tend to miss this, and we argue in the book that we miss it for 3 main reasons. First, we tend to focus on the broadening out of the distribution below the top, and we tend to forget about the very, very top. It's partly because that census statistics, as Jeff said, missed the top because of top coding, but it's also because we're not used to thinking about policies that affect the very rich. Whenever we think about inequality, the first thing we want to talk about is the minimum wage or the earned income tax credit, but not executive compensation policies or the way in which we deregulated financial markets or what we call the tax cut smart bombs that have been dropped like little payloads of cash onto the very, very rich. You really have to go inside that top 1%, even the top 1/10 of 1%, to see the most fortunate beneficiaries of government largesse over the last generation. The second thing you have to look at is the market-making role of government, the way in which government has reshaped markets for good and often for ill over the last generation. I think you see that nowhere more clearly than in financial markets. And finally, we argue you have to pay attention to what government hasn't done. You need to look at the various ways in which public policies have stayed stuck in place as our markets have transformed dramatically. And I think I have the best single example of this is the carried interest provision for hedge funds. Now, hedge fund managers made, on average, the top 25, $900 million in 2007. They get to pay 15% capital gains tax on that $900 million. And the reason they do is because there's an obscure provision of the tax code that was put in place before hedge funds even existed, that of course has been preserved thanks to the help of both Democrats and Republicans, who will go unnamed up to this day, even though it's widely viewed as completely inexcusable and unconscionable to have these hedge fund managers paying lower taxes than their assistants on their multi-million-dollar incomes. Third, the third argument is that we need to see, if we see this as government having an important role in this, a crucial role, we have to look at why government has transformed its role so much over this last generation. And I'll just say here that we tend to focus way too much on voters. Oh, is it that the white working class has abandoned the Democratic Party? What is the matter with Kansas? And we tend not to focus as much on the more obvious forces that have been reshaping policies for those at the very top, and that is organization, the way in which there's been a transformation of Washington that has very much helped the most fortunate beneficiaries of the post-1970s income explosion. We're talking about a world of politics that's awash in money, where lobbying expenditures have doubled just over the George W. Bush years, where even the official numbers, which vastly understate the true extent, we're talking about $4 to $5 billion being spent on lobbying, up from numbers that were below $1 billion just a decade or 15 years ago. And the other side of this is that both parties have been forced in this new environment to either radicalize or press to radicalize in the case of the GOP, or to mute in many ways their traditional commitment to populism in the case of the Democratic Party. And I think, you know, I'll end with two examples of this, because I think we're obviously seeing a major pushback against rising inequality, and I think the discussion to come will be really about to what extent are the reforms that have been put in place already, or the ones that may yet come, to what extent are those going to reverse this substantial shift? And I would just say, here's the two examples: healthcare and financial regulation. On healthcare, which I was very much involved in, to even get a bill considered, there had to be these huge concessions made to the most deep-pocketed interest. And I think that very much sort of indicates the extent to which, even on areas where there was a very strong case for action and strong support for it, at least at the outset, that there was this need to sort of buy off major interest. And then on financial regulation, we're, 18 months or more since the collapse of Lehman, and yet we're still debating whether or not a bill will get passed. I think it looks like we will get one, but in many respects it's going to be a compromise driven more, I think, by lobbyist demands in its specifics than driven by the clear voter outrage that has helped keep it on the agenda, and I think makes it very likely to be passed. So with that, I will stop. Thanks.
I'm just going to ask the panelists a couple of quick questions, and then we will go to your questions. But first, I want to thank each of the panelists for hewing more or less to the rigorous and onerous time constraints that were imposed. And I say that sincerely because the truth is that each of these panelists, they each have a lot to say, and it's very difficult, I know from experience, to condense a great deal of knowledge into such a short amount of time. That said, I'm going to ask you to do so again by commenting on a claim that, and Jacob just touched on this a little bit at the end of his comments, but in a sense, reflect on how much pushback you think there actually is, both in the American public and in the elected officials who say they're going to respond to all of this anger and so forth. In March, the New York Times, David Leonhardt published an article titled, "In Health Bill, Obama Attacks Wealth Inequality." And in that piece, he wrote that the bill was, quote, "the centerpiece of his deliberate effort to end what historians have called the age of Reagan." Do you agree? Yes.
I suppose I have to have a disclaimer. Politics are not my strong suit. Do I think Obama was thinking he was ending the age of Reagan in terms of inequality? I think, I remember that piece. I think that's a stretch. Do I think the health care bill will have that consequence? I think it will help along those lines. I think we have a long way to go in terms of social policy. I don't think social policy is the only answer. As I suggested, this is really a serious work problem in America that cuts across 60 to 80% or more of the working population.
Do others want to comment on that?
I'll just say very quickly that the answer is that no, I mean, it will not end the age of Reagan, and we very much live in the shadow of Reagan. Although we should understand that Reagan was quite a bit less radical than have been Republican politicians over the last 15 years. I mean, Reagan, after all, raised taxes several times, oversaw a major reform of the tax code that made it, if not markedly more progressive, I think a lot fairer, though that was all undone within 15 years afterwards. So my view of where we are is very much a kind of half full, half empty. I think we've had a concerted effort to try to address inequality, and it's obviously been driven mostly by an emergency response to an economic disaster, but I see in the financial market reforms, in healthcare reforms, a serious effort to try to push back. But the extent to which that has been stymied by the features of our political system that have helped encourage the runaway rewards at the top, such as the increasing use of the Senate filibuster to block serious reforms and the disproportionate weight of organized interest. The extent to which that's true, I think, really shows how hard it's going to be, and it's not going to happen overnight. And the last thing I would just say on that front is that this may well be the high water mark of the reform era, the Obama reform era. I mean, we're looking at a certain loss of seats for the Democratic Party in the fall, and I think a pivot in discussion toward deficits and concern about our nation's fiscal health. And so I think it's really a sign that there needs to be more than just election victories. There has to be some organizational and shifts in political reforms to really address these problems in the long term.
I think with all those caveats in mind, it is clear that the Obama administration is suffused with people who understand the inequality problem quite well. I mean, I've been surrounded by them and part of them at Harvard, at Princeton, and elsewhere, and that some of the key policy moves are clearly informed by this. So pumping money into early childhood education clearly reflects the work that Heckman has done. Pumping money into the junior colleges and to skills training, all of this does reflect some understanding of the role of education and training in the inequality picture, moving to try and ensure the uninsured. All of these devices clearly reflect an understanding that is, well, it's unprecedented in my lifetime anyway, in the administration for inequality is a root problem in the country. How close we get to addressing it depends on all of these pushback factors from the other side that are going to make it very difficult. But I don't think there's any question that administration and policy is informed by a very deep understanding of inequality as a central issue.
I may just add one thing to that, what I said. The health care policy is typical of Obama's emphasis on a more universalist strategy, because it's quite clear that the major beneficiaries are going to be the poor people and African Americans. And I think there is one long-term effect which I think we should consider, and which I think bothered the right very much. And if we look at the experience of Europe, there is a kind of long-term cultural cumulative effect as people come to recognize the benefits of the healthcare program, as they came to recognize the benefits of Social Security. They'll become more committed to and more sympathetic to the role of government, if you like, in reducing inequality. And that commitment, I think, may well spill over. Maybe perhaps I'm being too hopeful, but I think as people come to see the benefits and come committed to it, it will spill over into a broader commitment to the role of government in reducing inequality. That's my optimistic hope, and I suspect that that certainly informed the Obama administration view of it.
You know, I wish I agree that should be the objective. I wish I believed that was truly the objective. Always we heard rhetoric about where to use your political capital, as if political capital was always there was a finite amount of political capital. What you're saying is if we pass successful social programs, we can build and expand political capital to go on to. Now, I would love to think that was an explicit idea in this administration, and I very much get the sense if it happened, it isn't. So. I think I think that is the optimistic view, and I have some hope myself about that.
I'll ask one more, and then I promise I will turn it over. Is it some people in some of you in your talks did refer to comparatively to how much more inequality there is in the United States than other advanced societies and other in Europe and so forth. Do you think that's because, broadly speaking, America has a greater tolerance for inequality, and that the sort of cynical view of this whole event would be, this isn't a problem, this is a consequence of a system that Americans prefer, and if politicians campaign on equality, what the best they can do is equality of opportunity. That equality of outcome is simply an un-American thing. Yes, Catherine.
So since Jacob got to plug his book, I'll plug mine, that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Who Cares? Public Ambivalence and Government Activism from the New Deal to the Second Gilded Age. And the last part of the book about the Second Gilded Age actually attacks directly this question and argues that it's absolutely not the case that American tolerance for inequality has grown. In fact, it's gone entirely the other direction. You might be surprised to hear that, given the election victories of Republicans over a number of decades. But in fact, all of the survey evidence we have suggests the opposite. Growing intolerance for runaway CEO pay, growing intolerance for inequality, and even mild upticks of the kind that Orlando would be looking for in support for redistribution and government activism on behalf of the poor. Certainly no great, even around welfare reform, no great big huge shift in the so-called feelings thermometer against the poor. So in fact, I don't think there is any evidence that we are, at least within our own sphere, growing increasingly tolerant of inequality. I don't think that's the case at all. On the other hand, we do have a long-standing allergy to government activism, and that's what the rest of the book looks at. It looks at the 1930s and the 1960s. But if I can split the difference between you, the one point that I would agree with is that as social programs become part of the household budget, as they become part of the income stream that American families depend upon, they become really hard to touch. And that's why, as Jacob has told us before, the speed with which health reform begins to take an effect is so important. Because if it takes till 2014 or 2018 before those benefits become very clear, it's going to be quite vulnerable. But as soon as those benefits become part of the household calculus, they become almost untouchable and politically almost inviolable. And that's why the speed really matters. And that is the history of Social Security. It took time before it became part of the standard household budget. But once it was, woe be unto any politician who tried to attack it. The same thing was true of Medicare. When Medicare was first passed, it was really it was supported, but it was controversial, and it got more controversial, actually, over the succeeding years. But once it became part of the household budget, get your hands off my Medicare was the answer.
One quick point, and I believe I'm generally correct about this. European economies don't distribute income more equally than the American economy. It's after social programs and after tax income that's more equal. So prima facie, that would suggest European people or their governments are more interested in equalizing outcomes than the U.S. government, at least historically, and for whatever whatever conflicts and traditions.
Could I just add, there are contradictory trends in American attitudes, because this country is also, I'd say, extremely, more than any other country, committed to individualism. And it will often go along with the kind of trends which you find, which sort of leads one to hear out as one tries to make sense of attitudes. But there's no doubt of this powerful commitment, more than any other of the advanced countries, which I think works against it. And there's also, and related to this, something which I spent a lot of time studying. I won't plug my book on freedom among Americans, but the extreme commitment to the ideology of freedom in America often wreaks havoc with the equal, if you like, or the opposing tendency towards idea of fairness and equality, and so we're a very contradictory and complex society, and the problem is which of those trends will sort of work out.
Okay,
yield
we're
my
gonna
time to
we're
the
go,
audience.
we're going yeah we're going to turn to the audience. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Please keep the questions succinct, not speeches. Questions. Thank you. Back there. Yes.
Bit of a double.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Brown. I'm a law professor at George Washington and a fellow here at New America. I wondered, pulling together strands of what Professors Newman and Pattison spoke about, whether or not the long-term, what are the long-term marital implications of people 16 to 24 who are having difficulty in the workforce? If you put it together with what Orlando said about there being some sort of connection between people having a commitment to a job and people having a commitment to broader social relationships, what are the implications of that for the likelihood that people will form long-term relations, will stay in those relations, will have children, and if they don't, what are the long-term poverty implications of that? Or am I overstretching, pulling too many strands together?
Okay, let's take 2 more. One here, and then we'll switch across and identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Norman Birnbaum. I'm oldest living survivor of the nation's editorial board, who's also Compass Mentis. I noticed that our distinguished panel omitted any mention of trade unions, which is interesting, and given their numerical decline, it's also understandable. But this leads to a question. The European model, which has been referred to, rests to some considerable extent on education, political and social education, by social democratic and social Christian parties, backed by trade unions. And the interesting question for the panel is, what organizational models can you think of in the society which would sustain those politicians who do seek to push back?
We'll take one over here, and then we'll move to the back after we answer these. Yes.
Thank you. Suzanne Ehlers. I'm serving as interim president of Population Action International. And we work globally thinking about investments in women, specifically their healthcare needs and how that helps address problems of inequality. And some of you referred a little bit to the gender lens, and I'm just wondering if anyone's willing to comment a bit on, are women suffering more in this current climate of inequality? And are there any policy recommendations geared toward women, both white and women of color, that can help kind of raise all boats? Wondering if there's a gender element to this that we didn't discuss in depth today.
3 great questions. Anyone want to start?
I'll jump in since I yielded my time before. I'm going to seize it this time and respond to the second question in particular, because it actually links back to your comparative question very, very closely. And I think that's exactly the point, and I wish I'd had more time to elaborate, but I think that's exactly the point, that voters on their own have a very hard time understanding the complex details of public policy or how it links up to their lives. Just look at the financial market reform debate. Republicans apparently have been unable to win the war to define a bill that will make it harder for bailouts to occur as a bailout, but the fact that they even thought they might be able to get away with that, and the fact that there's, I think, a very strong chance that the Democrats could lose the House, suggests that this, that the vote is a very blunt instrument, and voters have a very hard time understanding, especially in a society marked by a great deal of skepticism toward government, exactly what the right way to proceed is. And this is not, a false consciousness argument, and it's not to say that voters are fools. It's to say that they can be fooled, and that they need organizational support and cues to be able to make informed judgments. And the decline of unions, it strikes me, as one of the most important ways in which the larger electoral and organizational environment for voters has changed in ways that have made it harder for them to get those cues. And I'll give you one comparative point on this. Americans actually look very tolerant of inequality compared with citizens of other nations when you look at the gap between what they say people earn and what they say people should earn. But the reason that they're more tolerant, turns out that they believe there's a lot less inequality in the United States than there is. And my favorite example of this is if you survey Americans and you ask them to say what the average income of a CEO of a large national corporation is, they come up with what must have seemed like a huge number to them, like Austin Powers, and Dr. Evil says the ransom is $1 million. And when he comes back from, the 1960s, they came up with $500,000 as the average pay of a CEO of a large national corporation. The National Election Studies just recently asked a question about inequality. It says, should government reduce income differences? Only about 1 in 5 voters said that was a good idea. And then they were told what the share of income was of the top 10%, and then 55% said it was a good idea. So I don't know if I wouldn't say that more information is the only thing, but more organizational cues could surely help.
I think I can answer both Eleanor and Susan together. Yes, there's a very important gender implication of what's happening. With respect to African Americans, the recent changes have far more adversely affected men than women. And that simply exacerbates a situation which has been building for some time now, in which women are finding it harder and harder to find marriageable men. And this, as I said, has been continuing for some time. It's in educational performance. It's happening in the entire society, but extremely so among blacks. And to the degree that returns to education have become increasingly more important, we find that problem being sort of exacerbated. With respect to unions, well, I think Obama clearly has a dilemma here, and it's sort of right in the news now with respect to the teachers' union, because one side of his social policy, which is to try to do something about the school system, which he's put a lot in terms of addressing the problem of inequality for everyone, but especially for African Americans, with these horrendous dropout rates, which I mentioned earlier. Seems to mean, to him anyway, and his education secretary, doing something really fundamental about teaching. But that gets him in serious trouble, as is being played out in the news every day with one of the few really powerful unions that remain. And I think this is played over in many other respects. And to give one more, the Supreme Court recent decision to allow corporations to basically, support campaigning to the degree that they want to, leaves the only balance for the Democrats with the unions. So this is a dilemma which I don't know the answer to, but the Democrats are really caught in a bind here.
I think we have time for a few more questions, maybe in the back. Someone I can't see, if there is a hand up there, and I'm sorry, the lights are bright, so.
Okay, sorry. This is for Professor Patterson, although others may want to answer. My name is Chester Hartman. I'm from PRAC, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. Your Harvard colleague, who many months ago was guilty of the crime of entering one's house while black, had an op-ed in the Times the other day about compensation for slavery, which is very interesting facts. But I think despite the issue of who's responsible, how you allocate it, I don't think was strongly enough saying that there should be compensation. And I'm wondering what you feel about it and how that would affect the inequality issue.
Well, I can be brief on that. I've always strongly opposed reparation. I don't think it's a good idea, because what it does, if it were to pass or something done, it would simply say, okay, we've paid you off, shut up. And I think there are other ways in which America can make up back for past crimes against black Americans. As for the main point of the article, I've spent a good part of my life, before I started studying freedom, I spent most of my life studying slavery. And I've long known that the Hollywood version of how the slave was captured, which is the whites getting off a boat and casting a net over blacks. I mean, that blacks were never that stupid. And that to ship 12.5 million people at a time when you didn't have steamboats, but sort of sailing boats, required a hell of a lot of complicity on the west coast of Africa. So I'm glad Skip and the others are catching up with this. We've known this a long time among those of us who are specialists in slave studies. Its political implications, unfortunately, are not so pretty.
One more question from the back, and maybe one more from the front, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, my name is Cecilio Morales. I'm with the Employment and Training Reporter. And I mostly have a question for Catherine Newman. And with respect to the age gap with unemployment, I've been hearing a lot of that. EPI recently had a thing about the interns, and there have been a lot of papers on the youth. And one of the things that I wonder about, whether it will play out the way you're saying, because in a way, there's this big, huge generation, the boomers, who are going to move out of the labor market, leaving a huge gap that I would assume the younger generation will have to fill.
Okay, and one very last question, all the way up here. This woman has had her hand up.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I have two questions. The first one is, what are the jobs that these people are going to have? I was working on manufacturing in the 80s at IBM, and the whole discussion was we're moving from a manufacturing to a service job. Service jobs, what do they produce? I mean, in a sense, one of the financial problems we had was it was sort of a service job, and they produced nothing except money for the people at the top. And the other question I have is, how do we make this change about lobbyists? Because it requires people on the Hill to vote. They get paid not to vote for the kinds of changes we need. It seems to me that we're in a real pickle, and I can't see any way out of it.
Okay.
So let me take the first question, and I'll leave the others, the second to others. You know, when I was a young assistant professor, I remember people saying, everything's going to be fine in the university world because all those people are going to retire and it's going to open up huge numbers of jobs. And what happened was we had this huge raft of adjuncts, and that huge number of jobs never did materialize. And that shows us that it's very difficult to make predictions about what will happen around the behavior of cohorts. Richard Alba actually agrees with you, and his most recent book predicts the same kind of rosy picture in the future because of boomer retirement. But I think we're going to find boomers aren't going to retire. They don't have the money anymore, and they are going to stay in the labor force. And we see a very large number of people in their 70s and even 80s coming back into the labor force because they can't afford to live, and their retirement savings got blown up in the latest financial crisis. So it's a real problem because we don't have mandatory retirement, and that means that and we're living longer because we're healthier, which is a good thing in many ways. But it is clogging up the labor market at the top with people who still need to earn a living, and many of whom had children later in life, whose responsibilities for those children are taking up an ever longer period of their own lifetimes. So, well, eventually, someday, the retirement of my generation may turn out to be a boon for the next generation. That is a very long way off, and it isn't going to save people who are in their 20s right now, or not anytime soon anyway.
Jobs.
Yeah, I think where are the jobs is the right question. That's what I was trying to get at. That's what we face, and when I talk, I talk with a little bit of facetiousness that we don't have an inequality problem, but we really have a jobs problem. And I don't think education alone is going to solve that problem. One number, for example, we did some work at our think tank at the New School. 25 to 34-year-olds, the median wage for a college graduate working full-time, young college graduate, has not risen since 1969. That's for the college graduate, since 1969. For 35 to 44-year-olds and 45 to 54-year-olds, it's risen at a marginal annual rate over that period of time. There's big inequality within the college education group. That's not to say, and then I always say, that doesn't mean I'm going to tell my daughter don't bother getting a college degree. That's a different issue. College will help. A lot of college people, you can't do without it, and it would help. Where are the jobs is the issue, and that's really what we should be addressing. And it's a very difficult question. Should there be serious industrial policy in America? I think there probably should be. I myself used to be a little bit ambivalent. I always sided with it, a little bit ambivalent. I think we got to stop wasting time. We need, and it can be allied with public investment. I don't think we're conscious enough of the disadvantages of the large majority. I don't think we're conscious enough of the inequality in capabilities, to use the now famous Amartya Sen phrase, in creating capabilities. Forget equality of opportunity. We need some kind of equality of capabilities. Time has changed. And my thesis, including in the book, The Case for Big Government, is government has to change as times change. And government, I think Jacob was alluding to that to some degree. Government policies simply haven't changed. And, you know, trade unions weren't great in the healthcare debate, in the national healthcare debate. I would have liked to kick most of them at the jet window, since more or less since the Truman period on the national healthcare debate. But I just want to make that final point. I do think there is a big missing organization for people who are suffering, to help them understand why they're suffering. And that's partly why what happened in Kansas, I think, happened in Kansas.
Do you want to
There
have
are
a
no
list?
jobs for college graduates. Imagine the situation for high school graduates and dropouts. That's the dilemma. There was a time when, of course, being a high school graduate, I mean, you could, you know, with hard work, with work ethic and so on, you could eventually hope for the foreman's job. That world is gone. It was supposed to have been replaced, however, by a world with a different kind of job, service, and so on, which hasn't developed. So it gets worse and worse the lower down you go.
Can I just
Jacob,
say
yes.
2 words? I guess.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I just realized it's quite late, and I don't want to take up any more of your precious time. I'll just say that on the big question is what is to be done, and I think it's going to take political reform. I don't think labor unions are going to be able to provide the kind of clout that we need for that kind of reform in the near term. Just look at the fact that the Employee Free Choice Act has about the chance of getting enacted as the proverbial snowball in hell. And I think that the place to look for inspiration is not the New Deal, but the Progressive Era. It was 30 years of reform that stretched over the course of a tumultuous period in our nation's history, and that involved elite leadership, small-scale victories that were built upon, and most important of all, reform, and more reform. And I would start with eliminating the Senate filibuster.
Right. Thank you all for coming. A few points of information. If you missed a presentation, you can watch it at the New America's website, which will have a full version of the event you just attended. And you can hear all the panelists at that time. Also, please look out for the Nation magazine's issue, which will come out based on these talks, and each of these great panelists will have an essay in that issue on the subject of inequality. So thank you again.